Hello, fourth grade, and happy Memorial Day week. So, something really cool happened. Well, especially if you're an ELA teacher, you think it was really cool happened. Something cool happened amidst all of this quarantine stuff that's happening, and it is this: poetry is in the news. So, believe it or not, there has been a few articles going around about how poets have been inspired or even uninspired by everything that's going on in the world. So, I thought this was a great time to dive into some poetry because it's in the news, and poetry is not something that makes the news very often. So let's see, what are we gonna do today? That is a big old picture of me. All right, so first we're gonna read the news article about the poetry. Then we're gonna discuss it briefly. Then we're gonna learn some poetry basics, and then you're gonna get some directions to write on your own. Sound good? All right, let's start with reading the article. All right, here is the article right here. It is on News ELA, but if you'll notice, it was by the Associated Press, which means that it was printed in all sorts of newspapers all across the country, and then News ELA just picked it up and rewrote it for teachers to use and kids to use. So this is called New Anthology Collects Dozens of Poems About Pandemic. An anthology is just a collection of things. So, like, if you made a playlist with like 20 MP3 songs on it, then that playlist of the 20 songs would be an anthology. So, this is like a collection of poems that are all going to be printed in one book, and they're all going to be about the pandemic. So, let's quickly just read the caption because the article is a lot about her. She's a poet. Her name is Ada Limon. It says poet Ada Limon's poem about the coronavirus pandemic is among more than 80 included in an anthology, Together in a Sudden Strangeness, coming in ebook and audio formats on June 9th. Cool. So if you like this poetry stuff, maybe you can get that book. It's coming out on June 9th. Poet Ada Limon struggled to write as the coronavirus spread in March. She said she felt flattened and silenced by the illness, which had shut down much of the world she knew. I could call nothing to me. I'd think of a sound, a word, a subject, and it was all failing, she said. I would look at my own poems and think that even their subject that I was tied to still felt distant to me. When she finally moved to write a poem in April, she wrote a kind of anti-poem. It was a list of subjects she was no longer able to write about. A relief. I didn't know what it was going to do, but it felt a great relief to list things that I could no longer access. And by access, she means that she couldn't really think about or focus on. She ended the poem with a cry. I am asking you to touch me. She called it the end of poetry. Limon's poem is among more than 80 poems in a new anthology or collection of poems. The book is called Together in Sudden Strangeness. It is coming in ebook and audio formats June 9th and as a hardcover in November. The book was put together by Alice Quinn. Quinn is a former New Yorker magazine poetry editor. The book includes poems from famous poets like Carl Phillips, Evie Shockley, Yusef Komunkhaya, Grace Shulman, and others. The book's title comes from a poem by Pablo Neruda called Keeping Quiet. His poem has the lines, "We would all be together in a sudden strangeness." Those lines capture how people are currently feeling as the coronavirus has forced people to shelter in place when possible. Poets as witnesses. Poets have always been those we turn to as witnesses, Quinn said. Poets can make a moment like this clear, she said. Novelists will likely take longer to fully absorb the coronavirus into their work, but poetry is more immediate. It allows for creation in the heat of the moment. Limon's The End of Poetry was printed in April in The New Yorker. The work has been widely shared online. It has gotten praise from such writers as the poet Brenda Shaughnessy, who said, I can hardly believe it's real. It's so right. At least one poet, Julia Guez, has tested positive for the coronavirus, also called COVID-19. Her contribution is titled, If Indeed I Am Ill, Brother. The other poems in Sudden Strangeness include works from doctor poets. One is by Amit Mujumdar. Sorry, I'm not doing great with these names. And it is called An American Nurse Foresees Her Death. The book has a poem on loneliness, Storm by Camellia Aisha Moon. Joshua Bennett's Dad poem is a take on new parenthood during a time of social distance. Social distancing, also called physical distancing, means keeping space between yourself and other people. It is to slow the spread of coronavirus, which has been declared a pandemic. That means it has spread widely. Julia Alvarez uses the language of illness and disease to look at the fate of the poem. Her poem, How Will the Pandemic Affect Poetry?, has the following lines. Will poetry go viral? Will it disease infect us? Will it help build up antibodies against indifference? Will poems be the only safe spaces where we can gather together? Lamone was not the only poet who felt blocked from her writing. Quinn said about 30 poets she contacted said that they had been unable to write. Another poet in the book, Major Jackson, said he knows of many writers who are having trouble writing. He said that he and his wife and fellow poet Dee Dee Jackson decided to write every day after they began staying at home. It was a way to distract themselves from current events, but also absorb them. His poem in the book is entitled Invocation. It is a call for better things. It seeks no more rallies of hate and a return to old times. Here are other lines from the poem. We want the father in the park running, behind a child pedaling into her future. We want to turn a corner and stumble upon the muted concert of two men in embrace with entangled eyes. We want to hear a faraway train whistle cast a spell on the coming night. Okay. So poetry is in the news, and there's this great new book coming out that shares a lot of these poets who have shared their thoughts about coronavirus and what all this staying home is all about. I wanted you to think for a minute. Like I said, next we're going to briefly discuss the article. So why poetry, right? Like, I think some people often ask that, like, why wouldn't you just write like regular paragraphs or a novel or a chapter book, right? Well, this article starts to answer some of that question, especially down here. So poets often try to capture a moment or a feeling of a moment, whereas a novel might be trying to tell you a story, or a chapter book is trying to tell you a story, tell you about the characters, and sort of say what happened. But poems are often trying to tell you what it felt like. So notice it says poets can take a moment like this and make it clear. Whereas a novelist, or that's someone who writes a chapter book, they will likely take longer to understand the coronavirus and make it part of their work. But poetry is more immediate. It allows for creation in the heat of the moment. So poems are often much shorter, right? They're, maybe only one page or a half a page. So it doesn't take months to write, and they can publish their poems and get a book out like this with 80 different poems in it, all describing different people's feelings, and sort of use words like as if they're an art form, right? A poem is almost like a painting with words. It creates images in your head, it creates emotions and feelings, and it seems like that is what these poets are trying to do, is to create the images and feelings of what all this pandemic feels like to people, but do it with words in a way that people really, really connect with, right? Instead of a really long, like 200 or 300 page book, it might only be 200 or 300 words total. Okay. Confused? Maybe. That's okay. Stick with me. Once you see the target, you'll be like, oh, I'm good. I can do this. No, we'll just close the current tab. Poetry is in the news. Let's go back to here, and let's go back to here. Okay. Yeah, so we did all these things. We discussed briefly. All right, so let's say you wanted to be a poet. You wanted to write something that would get published in an anthology that people could read on June 9th, right? Um, how would you do that? Well, let's learn some poetry basics, because I can't really tell you, hey, go write a poem, if you don't really have any idea of like what a poem is other than that article we just read. And then we'll give you a few directions to write your own. Poetry, elements and structure mini lesson. Okay, so like I said, once you see the target, I think you'll feel a little bit more relieved about all this poetry stuff. Today's target is, I can play around with poetry. That's all I'm asking you to do today. So if that article was confusing and didn't make a whole lot of sense, and you feel like some of the things we're about to learn about the basic parts of a poem feel a little confusing, it doesn't matter. It's about playing around. Let me show you something. Do you remember the very first time you ever played ukulele with Miss Barone? She didn't try to explain it all to you for hours and hours and hours and then hand you the ukulele. She just sort of handed you the ukulele and just let you play around with it, right? Well, poetry is kind of like learning music like that. Like, you get to just play and have fun. It's like, does that sound good? Does that sound good? And what are these, what do these turny things do? How many strings are there? Where does the sound come from? How am I supposed to hold it? Am I left-handed? Do I run it with a bow? Right? You're just exploring it. So it's like how you would just explore a new instrument. Do you think you're going to be really good at an instrument the first time you pick it up? Nope, probably not. You're going to have to play around with it and then practice a little bit and get better and better and better. So today's goal is to just play around. It's not to write a masterpiece, right? It's just to play around with poetry. But let me give you a few directions to sort of guide your playing around with poetry, so that you're learning as you're playing around. My first question about, so what we're going to do for the rest of this time is we're going to kind of learn like, well, what is a poem anyway? So my first question is, does all poetry rhyme? Think about it. Does a poem have to rhyme? Well, you probably are way ahead of me. The answer is no. Poetry does not have to rhyme. I think a lot of people, when they think of a poem, they automatically think like roses are red, violets are blue. I forgot how the rest of that goes. It's supposed to rhyme. Well, or like a Dr. Seuss book, like I will not eat it in a house. I will not eat it with a mouse. Right? I will not eat green eggs and ham. I will not eat it. Sam, I am. That's a rhyming poem, right? But it doesn't have to rhyme. And when poetry doesn't rhyme, it's called free verse. So poetry that does not rhyme and has no regular rhythm. In free verse, the poet creates the rules for the meaning, look, and sound of the poem. So here's an example from Carl Sandburg, who wrote a poem called Fog. And you'll notice it doesn't rhyme. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. So he's describing like a foggy day where the fog just sort of like comes in and then sort of moves away. And he's doing it in a way that's like painting a picture, right? Instead of just saying, hey, I looked out my window and I saw some fog over there in the city. He's saying it in more beautiful language and helping describe it in a way that is more emotional and connects with you. So that is free verse. What else makes a poem a poem? All right, well, poets use line breaks. If I'm writing a chapter book, I'm going to write full sentences, and I'm going to write paragraphs, and I'm going to arrange those paragraphs into chapters, right? And I'm going to create a whole book. And we've learned about all those rules about like proper sentences. They have to have a noun and a verb and a period and a capital. Well, poetry gets to break a lot of those rules. So one of the things that poets do is they do not arrange their poems in paragraphs or even in sentences. A line break is the place where the poet chooses to end a line, often used to indicate rhythm or to represent meaning. So somebody wanted to write about this picture here. It's so cute, right? I'm not even a big cat fan, and this thing is so cute. So someone wanted to describe what was happening in this picture. And they decided to write a poem about it. So they could have just said, there was a cat laying down and it was sunny. But they wanted to describe it in beautiful language. So they named a poem called Sun, and it goes like this. The sun is a leaping fire, too hot to go near, but it will still lie down in warm yellow squares on the floor, like a flat quilt, where the cat can curl and purr. So you'll notice that, look, they ended their line, it's not a full sentence, just the sun is a leaping fire, too hot to go near, but it will still lie down in warm yellow squares on the floor, like a flat quilt, where the cat can curl and purr. Yeah, you can clap, I know. I mean snap, whatever. Yeah, so that's what a line break is saying, instead of saying like all in one line, the sun is a leaping hot fire too hot to go near, they split that phrase into 4 lines. The sun is a leaping fire too hot to go near. All right, let me give you another example. More line break examples. So this is without line breaks. It's called The Big Field by Donald Graves. Mr. Gammons mows the big field with his tractor, then he rakes and bundles hay for the barn. George and I grab our bats, gloves, and balls and race across the field like major leaguers in spring training. We hit long flies to each other all afternoon. We never lose a ball in the stubble, and we don't stop until Mother calls us for supper. All right, it's kind of just a paragraph, and it's really hard to get a great image of what's happening in that paragraph. But let's see when we break the lines and arrange them in just the right way. Let's see if it paints a better image in our mind of what is happening in this scene. Here we go. Mr. Gammons mows the big field with his tractor, then rakes and bundles hay for the barn. George and I grab our bats, gloves, and balls and race across the field like major leaguers in spring training. We hit long flies to each other all afternoon, never lose a ball in the stubble, and don't stop until Mother calls us for supper. It's like this poet was trying to describe one of those summer afternoons where you're playing with your friend and you go play some baseball, and he's just trying to describe sort of that feeling of it, right? And by having these line breaks, it really helps us create that visual. It's like a painting in our mind instead of just a paragraph describing it. So those are line breaks. Okay. Well, what's a stanza? This is probably a word you've heard before, but what is a stanza? Well, in poetry, each line of words is placed within a stanza. It's a group of lines. So a stanza is kind of like a paragraph in poetry. Let me show you an example. Look, this fog one. How many stanzas do you see? Well, I see the title, I see the author's name, and then I'll tell you there are 2 stanzas. The first one is, the fog comes on little cat feet. And the second one is, it sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. Notice there's a break here. It's just sort of like a paragraph. So this is the first stanza, this is the second stanza. Why do authors separate stanzas? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, but it's similar to why in regular writing you would break your writing up into paragraphs. Similar ideas get grouped together in similar stanzas, right? The stanzas might also help create rhythm or structure to the poem, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But let me show you another really clear example of a poem with very clear stanzas, and it will help you see how authors use them. All right. This one is called Bed in Summer by Robert Louis Stevenson, a very famous poet. And I will read it. In winter, I get up at night and dress by yellow candlelight. In summer, quite the other way, I have to go to bed by day. I have to go to bed and see the birds still hopping on the tree, or hear the grown-up people's feet still going past me in the street. And does it not seem hard to you when all the sky is clear and blue, and I should like so much to play to have to go to bed by day? So what is he describing here? I thought this one was perfect for this time of year. I'm going to give you a quick explanation and then reread it and see if you can picture it in your mind. So he's talking about how in the summer the sun stays out so much later, especially in places like Rochester, right? In the winter, it's dark at like 5 o'clock. And when you go to bed in the winter, it's been dark for a long time. But in the summer, you're often going to bed and it's still light outside. There's still action going on outside. Your neighbor might even be like mowing the lawn or something and you're trying to go to bed because the sun doesn't go down until like 9:30 at night. So now that you have an idea, this is what he's trying to say. Notice he arranged this into 3 stanzas. Each stanza has 4 lines, right? So it's very structured and organized. All right, let me reread it. Bed in summer. In winter, I get up at night and dress by yellow candlelight. In summer, quite the other way. I have to go to bed by day. I have to go to bed and see the birds still hopping on the tree, or hear the grown-up people's feet still going past me in the street. And does it not seem hard to you when all the sky is clear and blue? And I should like so much to play to have to go to bed by day? I don't think he likes going to bed by day. I think he'd rather stay up until it's dark out, right? Okay. That was really, I just love that poem because I know that feeling. And I know my boys know that feeling, right? Like they never want to go to bed when it's still light outside. And I also just wanted to show you how authors arrange into 3 stanzas, or it could be any number of stanzas, but stanza 1, stanza 2, stanza 3. Okay. Thumbs up if you understand. Thumbs in the middle. Let's go back to the target, though, for a minute. Could you at least do this now that you have some idea? You know to use line breaks. You know to create stanzas. You know to paint a picture, to share an emotion. These are things that we've covered, right? So just knowing that, you can probably play around with poetry. I haven't taught you much, but it's like ukulele. I've at least taught you how to hold it with the right hands, right? Okay. Well, I can teach you a little bit more to help you play around. Here are a few topics that you could write about. Remember, your task for the day is going to be to play around, but actually your exit ticket will be a couple spots for you to be able to write some of your own poems and share them with me. All right, so a few topics. Well, it seems perfect since it's 90 degrees outside and it's about 115 degrees in the room I'm in right now, and you could probably see the sweat glistening on my forehead. It seems perfect like a topic to write about summer. So whatever emotion or feeling or awesomeness, whatever inspires you about summer, you could write a poem about that. Well, you could follow along what those writers for that anthology are doing and write about quarantine and all this coronavirus stuff. Or, this is also appropriate. Doesn't the end of the school year have sort of a certain feeling about it, right? It feels very different than it does back in September. There's this kind of like, I don't know, energy about the end of the school year. So those are 3 topics you can pick from. I'm okay with you picking any of your own topics, but those 3 seem like just prime for like really capturing a moment in time. Okay. How else can I help you? There are a few types of poems that you can try. These will be posted in Google Classroom, but I'm just going to show them to you quickly right now. So let me exit here for a second and go back to here. All right. This document will be in Google Classroom for you to be able to use these as a reference when you're writing your own. So there's a thing called an acrostic poem. And like for instance, this one is about donuts, and you'll notice that each line begins with the first letter of donut, so D-O-N-U-T-S. And this helps them with their line breaks too, because they know, oh, I better go to a new line because I need to use the word that begins with O. So this was someone describing donuts, and this is what it says. Delicious morning treats, only good the first day. Need a cold glass of milk with them. Usually like chocolate donuts with sprinkles the best. Tastes like a little bit of heaven. Super sweet, once in a while treat. Nicely done. Or there's one about oceans. See, notice it spells ocean, O-C-E-A-N. Octopus swims near the rocks. Crab crawls on the sand. Eel slithers in a sea cave. Angelfish swims gracefully under the waves. Narwhal hunts for fish in the Arctic. So describes the ocean. So that is one way when you're playing with poetry, you could try an acrostic poem. Maybe the word summer could be going down here, or the word corona, or the word pandemic, or the word quarantine, or June, or end of school year, whatever you want to do. An alliteration poem is where you reuse the same letter a lot. So my silly S poem. 7 silly southern seamstresses sewed 60 silky strands of silk for the superbly styled soccer star's shirt. Those are really hard, and the point is not necessarily to just make it a tongue twister, but it's just to use a lot of the same letters because it sort of brings some beauty and sort of some style to your writing. A cinquain poem. This is another great choice. Cinq means 5 in French, so it's a poem with 5 lines, and there's a structure to it. So the first line is one word. That's it. Then the second line is 2 words to describe the title. The third line is 3 ing words that show action. The fourth line is 4-word phrase that expresses a feeling. And then 1-word synonym for the subject. So those are a lot of words, but let me explain let me give you this example. So if I wanted to write about a mouse, I might say this. Mouse, tiny, fast, scurrying, sniffing, squeaking, looking for some cheese, rodent. So notice line 1 is the subject of the poem. So maybe it's summer, right? And then the 5th line is another word for that same subject. And then it's 2 describing words, 3 ing words, and then a 4-word phrase that expresses a feeling. Let's do shoes. Shoes, comfortable, old, walking, running, jumping. Wear them almost everywhere. Sneakers. A 5 senses poem. You can get an idea what this is going to be about your 5 senses, right? So you choose a topic and describe it in 1 word. And then describe it if it had a taste, a sound, a smell, what it looks like, and how it makes you feel. So here's an example. Fall is orange. It tastes like apple cider. It sounds like kids jumping in piles of leaves. It smells like warm pumpkin pie. It looks like a scarecrow in the middle of the field. It makes me feel crazy. It makes me feel cozy. Hawaii, tropical place. Hawaii is blue. It tastes like shaved ice. It sounds like waves crashing on the beach. It smells like plumeria flowers. It looks like my dream home. It makes me feel happy. So these are all different ones that you can try. I'm going to skip this one. It's kind of tricky. But again, you can play with it. I'll put this in there. There's a number poem. This is kind of cool. So you actually just count up. They're 10 lines long, and they can rhyme, but they don't have to, right? We talked about that. So, like, notice every new line starts with a number. So 1, rainbow lollipop. 2, pink cotton candies. 3, yellow gumballs. You kind of get the idea. Or this one actually counts down, which is really cool. All right. Oh, yeah, pyramid shape. So 1 noun, 2 describing words, 3 ing words, and then 2 short phrases or a question. So this is very similar to the cinquain. So horse, strong, graceful, trotting, cantering, galloping, beautiful creature, lovely to ride. I am going to put all of these in Google Classroom, so you can just pick a few and just play around with them, pick whatever topic you want. Another way to do it is to actually draw yourself a shape and then try to squeeze the words into the shape, because it sort of naturally gives a shape to your poem. So this is like a crescent moon, and it says, "The moon smiled at me as I said goodnight at the end of the day." Kind of fun. All right, I'm going to stop there, but you get the idea that there's a lot of options. So these will be in Google Classroom for you to play around with. All right, let me go back. I hit escape, and it escaped to the black. Okay, here we go. Back to PowerPoint. There we go. All right. I keep saying here we go, and all right, and nothing's working. My computer feels extra slow today, I think because it's so hot and summery. Okay, so here are your directions. There is an exit ticket, but all the exit ticket really is some spots for you to type in your poems. Use the resources in Google Classroom. So there will be this video, and then plus all of those example types of poems, like the cinquain and the alliteration poem, and the ones I just showed you. And then I would love if you wrote a couple of them. I'd be willing to share them, or you could share them on our ELA debrief, either this Friday, or if you end up working on it on Friday, you could share them next week. Because I think sharing poetry is so important, right? It's like these professionals, they wrote these poems about quarantine, and then they put them in a book and shared them with the world. They didn't just put them in a drawer and have nobody read them. So I would love to have you all just sort of play around and share. It's like we do in music class, right? You grab a ukulele, you mess around with it, you learn to hold it the right way, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, that actually sounded pretty good. Like, I learned something. And even if yours sounds like this, that's okay. We want to hear it too, okay? Like we said, we're not expecting perfection the first time. Your target was to just play around with poetry. So everyone should share at least one poem with Mr. Ditch, at least one in the exit ticket. But I'm going to leave a spot for 3 or 4 or 5 even, because I know some of you will want to write and just play around with many of them. You can choose if you want to handwrite them and then type them in, which is actually probably what I would suggest. I think handwriting them brings out more creativity, but handwrite them and then type them in, or you can just type them in. It's your choice. All right, friends, that is our introduction to poetry. Poetry's in the news, and 4th graders are going to write some great poems. I'm very excited about that. Enjoy your very hot week. I'm telling you. Remember how I said it was 115 in this room? It's now 125 Celsius. I am melting in here. Miss you all, and I hope you enjoy poetry. I'm looking forward to reading them. Have a great day.